O friends with whom my feet have trod the quiet aisles of prayer, glad witness to your zeal for God and love of man I bear. I trace your lines of argument, your logic linked and strong. I weigh as one who dreads dissent and fears a doubt as wrong. Those are the first two verses of one of my favorite poems, a poem called The Eternal Goodness by John Greenleaf Whittier. We are about to embark on a journey into the genre of poetry. Now, I know some of us aren't excited about poetry. Now, that was clear, right, when I mentioned it last time, and I don't blame you. As we start out, I want to remind you of a couple things. Number one, I'm not trying to get you to love poetry. I'm not necessarily a lover of poetry. I have an appreciation for it, and that's what I want to build in you, is an appreciation, but here's how. An appreciation through an understanding of what poetry is, or let me put it this way. When you understand the value of poetry and what it does, what its properties are, I think you have an appreciation of literature. And so that's my goal. Not that we're going to be lovers of poetry, and I'm not even going to have you write any poetry. And I thought at one point, well, maybe I'll have them go ahead and they'll write like a sonnet to show their understanding of poetry, to show their competence in this unit. I'm not going to do that. This is not about teaching you how to write poetry. It's teaching you how to understand poetry, that when you encounter poetry, you get what its properties are, and you're able to appreciate it and use it for what it is worth. So that's our goal here. And before we go even much further, let me also, because of the properties of poetry can be either heavenly or hellish. It can be that grotesque. It can be that glorious. And I think you'll begin to grab why when we go further in talking about just what poetry is. But it's something I would encourage you to be careful as you ingest poetry. It's worth doing. It's powerful. Just by its nature, it can either be just heavenly, for lack of a better term, or it could be pretty hellish. But it's definitely worth reading and thinking about. And poetry has a way of helping us freshly think about subjects, think about what it means to be human, these universal realities, in a way that I think other genres just don't do that. So let's jump in and explore some poetry together. I have a few goals. Let's go over them, and then we'll begin to take them one at a time. So just when the unit's done, my desire is that you would be able to, number one, see poetry as literature. Understand poetry within the context of literature. Not all poetry, obviously, is literature, just as much as not all words that rhyme are poetry, right? Just because it's a rhyme and it's a good rhyme doesn't mean it's poetry. And at the same time, just because it's poetry doesn't mean it's literature. So I want you to think of it in the context of literature, understand it, what it would be as literature, and what it does then to literature. Because it's a different genre of literature. And just like short story has a specific thrust and something that it does within the genre of literature, the same with poetry. It does something to literature, and we need to ask ourselves, well, what does it bring to the table in the context of of literature as a genre? So we're going to just first of all say, let's see poetry as literature. Let's make sure we understand it as literature. At the same time, of course, we're going to want to understand, as best we know how, what poetry is. Number two, we're going to ask ourselves or identify through identifying its properties, what is its value? So poetry has value. Obviously, I just made that case. Well, I didn't really make the case. I just said it did earlier. And it does. And it's really chiefly housed in its properties. What makes it poetry? What makes it what it is? So we're going to ask ourselves, what is its value? And we're going to explore its properties. And there's two things primarily we're going to look at. We're going to look at what I'm going to call the humanity of poetry. Poetry has a way of giving us a more holistic communication. We're going to communicate with the author in a more holistic way. We're going to have a one-to-one, a face-to-face with the author. But not only that, it does this thing of allowing us to see the smirk on the author's face, to feel the pain or the loss that the author is feeling in a very immediate way. So the first thing is this fuller communication, this fuller interaction, right? Remember when we talked about communication, and which we'll talk about a little bit more later, this idea of an exchange where I have something, but then I give you that something, and now both of us have it. We share ownership of this, and we both can use it. We both can enjoy it. We both can contemplate it. So there's this glorious reality of communication where I have something, and I'm the only one who can enjoy it, hold it, and use it, whatever. But then when I share it with you, you are also able to do the same thing with that information. And so we have this concept of the communication is, again, it's almost like it's more human. It takes on and understand this correctly, but in a more spiritual reality to it. And when I say that, I don't mean just some out there thing. What I mean is the fact that we're creating the image of God. Poetry as a form of communication bears out that reality better than just writing prose. It bears out, again, you can see the smirk, you can feel the pain or the loss of the author of poetry in a way you just don't get to do that in prose. It doesn't work that way, not easily at least, and it's much more condensed often. But the second thing is, not only do we have this humanity, this more fuller communication, but we also have this immediacy with the author. So it's like we're right there talking to the author. When you read prose, often you're not really thinking about the author, you're thinking about what is being described. But you are brought face to face with the author. That, I think, is these two things, again, these are the properties, this is the value of it, are what cause it to be either heavenly or downright hellish, downright awful, grotesque. So we're going to do that. Then we're going to see if we can identify how poetry allows us to really understand what's happening in history. Someone said that literature was ripped away from history, which it never should have been and always needs to be brought back to history. And I am in agreement with that. I know we're teaching a literature class, and since we're not teaching a history class, but the value, if you really want the value of literature, you have to think about it historically as well. And there's something special, I believe, about poetry. It not only allows us to think about a time and what was going on in that time, but we get to, again, real face-to-face encounters with the people of history. So we don't only get to say, look at what this line of reasoning produced in a historical time period. We get to get face-to-face and really get with the emotion, the disregard or the decrying of an actual person who has a certain philosophy. You get to kind of know in a face-to-face encounter what the consequences of something like that might be. It's such an interesting thing, poetry. So we're going to look at history played out in poetry, really grabbing not just, again, a era, but the people within the era who held a certain line of reasoning. And then I also just want to explore some of the tools a little bit of creating the powerful imagery that poetry has that gives us these encounters. So that's what we plan on doing. Again, we're going to go through we're going to identify what poetry is, understand it as literature. We're going to then explore its value, those two properties that make it what it is, and I'm going to argue make it different than any other form of literature, of writing, of communication in the written sense. And we're going to explore those two properties of literature. We're also going to look at how poetry as literature helps us to really encounter a person, the actual people who hold a philosophy and the consequences of the philosophy they may hold. And then thinking just a little bit about the power and the imagery of how they create this imagery, this powerful imagery. All right, so I'm going to do short videos this time just to kind of break it up a little bit. And I hope what will happen is, and you can also go back to a specific part of a video and watch it again and say, I need to really think about what's the properties of poetry or something like that. So I'm going to break them up. I'll be right back.